just looking at how the services that organizations procure and that broader approach to services procurement can actually be used as a competitive advantage if it's leveraged properly. And that kind of sits alongside another point that's come to my mind, just based on what you were saying earlier when we were talking about the HR side of it, which is, again, this crossover with workforce. And we can come on to that, but it's almost like a bit of a future question of like, well, who's going to end up owning the overall work capacity and capability of an organization? Is HR going to, expand? Is it going to be a new function? Is it going to be total workforce management, strategic workforce? It's really interesting to see that because this is where orchestration comes into it and real sophisticated coordination, strategic thought, forward planning, all those sorts of things come into it in the sense of organizations have got all these different ways to do work and they need to work out what's the best horse for each course, and actually really learn to kind of push work down through the right channels. So I guess my question to you is really, do you see services procurement as having the potential to be a competitive advantage for organizations? And if so, why? Why do you see that, if that's the case?
I do see it as a competitive advantage. I'm not quite sure. Well, I think the reason I think it's a competitive advantage is for just what we talked about. It's messy. When you can get your arms around data, benchmarking, those types of things that clarify what services sourcing is about, that I think will be very helpful to be able to define where that function sits. And the reason I say that is that when I look at the travel industry, I've been involved with the travel industry for 20 years before getting into contingent labor. It always fell into indirect. It was always messy. And while I think that it's also becoming one of those categories that needs a different place to sit, it's going to depend on the maturity of the sourcing and procurement function. So I'm in LinkedIn. I'm happy to see a lot of messages come through from CPOs about what their commitment to AI is. But what I don't see is their commitment to looking at services procurement differently. So that maturity of in thinking of the CP at the CPO CFO level as to where this should sit, I think is a conversation for down the road. And I think it's going to take one to get rid of the conversation about procurement operations when the majority of that is in AI. Then what's left? It's that what's left that could be restructured into a different functional group, either under a CFO because there's still a financial impact, under a CPO who's has the forward thinking about looking at this kind of eliminating the silos that are kind of created in the structure now and bringing them up into standalone. And that's not the right word, but into their own functional glory.
Right.
A travel program, one that has a sourcing component, but probably more to the point is recognition for the management after. At BP, I had responsibility to manage the travel program. I worked closely with the sourcing function, and they literally sat next to me, but it still felt segregated. At GE, I had responsibility for sourcing and the program management. Once the sourcing was done, we spent the majority of our time on managing the program, managing the suppliers, the QBRs, the forward-thinking strategic sessions that we would plan for our next year and what their future looks like. How do we embrace their future as part of our future? So I think that view of a program that includes sourcing is probably a good way to look at it, regardless of where it sits in the organization. If it's in procurement because of the function, great. If it sits in HR contingent labor, for example, total talent management sits in HR, great. But it needs a home that's going to be appreciated for what it can do for the company.
Yeah, I love it. Having been involved in workforce stroke procurement related technology my whole career, I just find the way that how organizations do work, the way that's changed over the last 15, 20 years is absolutely fascinating. And the idea of who's responsible for that and how organizations get their arms around it and make those decisions effectively is something that I think is evolving at a really rapid pace now. When we came into kind of pre-COVID and during COVID, there was this whole kind of explosion of like gig style working. And suddenly people were working remotely as a bit more of a norm and things like that. The gig component has kind of was a burst up and has kind of quietened down a bit. It's still a component, but the services element is like this juggernaut that has drawn from some of the others. And I think one of the interesting observations I've seen around AI is it drives outputs. It drives an output mentality because ultimately, if you hire me and you're paying me based on time, then what I could do pre AI in 5 days, post AI, I might be able to do in 3 days. So is time the best measure of your engagement with me, however I'm engaged, or is it actually what I'm delivering that's the most important thing? So I think this growth of this output, outcome, deliverable mentality is something that's inevitable, and definitely we're seeing a big shift in that. Um, and it's already a fundamental part of how organizations get work done because it ties in with all the stuff that's outsourced to third party suppliers. And I just think that for me is where the wake up call is not just for CPOs, but for CEOs and the entire C suite to say, if your competitors are leveraging their service supply chain more effectively than you, more cost effectively with better relationships, better visibility on capabilities and skills, more ability to flex and manage where capacity has fluctuations. If they're doing that better than you, you're going to lose as an organization because you're not going to be able to deliver the actual work output that you need to compete with them in delivering your service or your product to your customers. And for me, that's the thing that's where the penny really drops with organizations, where they realize that this is absolutely strategic. It's not something that's just kind of like, oh, a bit annoying or that's how we've always done it. It's like, if you don't shape up, you're going to get overtaken pretty quickly, in my opinion. Um,
Well, I think that there's to align with what you just said, the CFO needs to look closely at his organization as well, because back to that conversation on where the budgets sit. If there is no change in where that budget sits, it'll still be in the details. Everything that we've talked about will be in the details. We'll have data, but that engineering leader, for example, will have responsibility for their budget with no visibility on the outcome of it, except for how he performed to manage his budget. So I think finance needs to look at really closely as to how much flexibility is needed when it comes to sourcing resources, services, and does it fall in an individual functions budget or is it managed differently at the budget level under the CFO? So I think that there's a correlation, and most CPOs that I have come across do have either direct reporting relationship with CFO. But I think there's got to be an evolution in the way CFOs look at their business as well to support what we're talking about and a kind of an evolutionary progression for procurement organizations.